In the year 1208 BCE, in the great city of Thebes, Egypt, Pharaoh Merneptah ordered a hymn of triumph to be etched into black granite. It was a litany of conquest, a celebration of victories over rebellious peoples across the Levant. Among the familiar names of Libyans, Canaanites, and Hittites, there appears one word that would echo across millennia: Israel. For the first time in all recorded history, a people we now recognize as the Jews are mentioned not in scripture or legend, but in stone. The Merneptah Stele, as it is now known, does not tell a tale of kings or miracles. It tells of survival, of existence, of a people whose identity had begun to crystallize amidst the shifting sands and collapsing city-states of the late Bronze Age. The world into which Israel emerged was one of instability. The great powers of the Near East, the Egyptians, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans, were in decline. Cities that had stood for centuries fell to fire, abandonment, or siege. Trade routes collapsed, economies contracted, and with the weakening of centralized authority, smaller groups found space to carve out lives of their own. In the central highlands of Canaan, archaeologists uncover the traces of small, unwalled villages, modest homes of mud brick and stone, dotted along the ridges of Samaria and Judah. Here, amidst shards of pottery, charred hearths, and broken tools, something is conspicuously absent: pig bones. The absence is not trivial. It signals a cultural choice, a nascent identity forming around dietary laws and ritual, distinguishing this community from its Canaanite neighbors. These villagers are the earliest proto-Israelites, the ancestors of the Jews. They are not yet a kingdom, nor a state. They are a people in formation, and yet, by virtue of their presence, they are remembered. Archaeological evidence from sites like Shiloh, Ai, Bethel, and Mount Ebal shows patterns of settlement that contrast sharply with their urbanized neighbors. These are hilltop villages, strategically positioned for defense, but small enough to maintain tight social cohesion. Houses are simple, usually single-room structures, with storage spaces for grain and communal areas for family gatherings. Pottery styles differ from Canaanite norms, and burnt layers within these sites indicate occasional conflict, likely between emerging groups competing for scarce resources in the post-collapse environment. It is a world of slow adaptation, of survival in marginal lands. Yet these conditions also allow cultural distinctiveness to flourish. The first external mention of Israel comes not from their own writings, for none yet exist, but from an Egyptian army rolling north to reassert control over Canaan. Pharaoh Merneptah, son of the legendary Ramesses II, faced unrest in the northern territories. His scribes recorded a series of victories in an elaborate hymn. Canaan is captive. Ashkelon is conquered. Israel is laid waste. These words, carved into the cold stone, mark the first historical acknowledgement of a people who, despite military defeat, would endure. It is a stark and unflinching record, yet one that inadvertently confirms the persistence of a society that would outlast the empires surrounding it. Within the highlands themselves, life went on quietly. Settlements expanded incrementally, family units multiplied, and trade, though limited, connected villages to larger centers in the valleys below. Archaeologists find implements for farming and herding, suggesting a mixed economy of agriculture and pastoralism. Olive presses, wine presses, and grinding stones indicate the beginnings of staple production, which would sustain these communities through decades of uncertainty. The hills of Canaan offered protection, but also isolation. These conditions fostered a sense of community identity distinct from the city-states along the coastal plains. They are, in many ways, the silent architects of a culture that would crystallize into the faith, law, and tradition recognized centuries later as Judaism. Religion in this period is a matter of reconstruction, pieced together from archaeology, later texts, and comparative analysis of Canaanite practices. The Proto-Israelites likely practiced a form of early monolatry, acknowledging many deities but directing worship primarily toward one, a deity they would later call Yahweh. Altars have been found on hilltops, often simple stone constructions where offerings were made. Ritual objects and the careful placement of animal remains suggest patterns of sacrifice, feasting, and communal gatherings. While the stories of Abraham, Moses, and the Exodus belong to later written tradition, the roots of identity, ritual practice, and covenantal thinking were likely emerging here, in the quiet villages among the ridges and valleys of Canaan. These early settlers were laying the foundation for a religion that would endure through empire, exile, and dispersal. By the end of the 12th century BCE, these communities had begun to coalesce into loose tribal confederations. They were not yet unified under a monarchy, but alliances formed for mutual defense and resource sharing. Warfare was common, not always against outsiders, but among neighbors vying for arable land and water. Archaeological evidence of burnt layers, arrowheads, and defensive structures points to intermittent conflict. At the same time, trade and cultural exchange continued, linking highland villages with the coastal cities of Canaan, the interior of Syria, and even distant Mesopotamia. Pottery styles and imported goods indicate a degree of sophistication and connectivity that belies the modesty of these settlements. The linguistic and textual legacy of this period, though sparse, begins to emerge in the form of inscriptions and early proto-writing found in the highlands. While no fully developed Hebrew script has been recovered from 1200 BCE, early alphabetic inscriptions in surrounding areas suggest the communities were beginning to record names, ownership, and religious dedications. Literacy would remain limited to elites or scribal classes, but the seeds of textual culture were planted, a culture that centuries later would produce the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, and the enduring corpus of Jewish law and tradition. Geopolitically, the region was a patchwork of emerging states, city-states, and hill country villages. Egypt's authority was in retreat, the Hittites had collapsed, and the Phoenicians were consolidating along the coast. The Proto-Israelites' position in the highlands allowed them to remain relatively insulated from the tides of empire, yet they were acutely aware of the power dynamics surrounding them. Tribes had to navigate alliances with neighbors, negotiate with city-state authorities, and defend themselves against raiders and rival factions. It was a precarious existence, but one that fostered resilience, adaptability, and a strong sense of collective identity. Material culture from this era, when examined closely, reveals subtle but important shifts. Pottery shows standardization, suggesting shared cultural norms. Burial practices indicate emerging religious and social ideas, with bodies interred in communal tombs or caves, sometimes accompanied by simple grave goods. The absence of imported luxury items in most villages implies a community focused on subsistence, yet the occasional presence of imported goods indicates selective participation in broader trade networks. These details, while mundane, illuminate the daily life of a people quietly forming a lasting cultural identity. By the middle of the 11th century BCE, the Proto-Israelites had survived the collapse of empires, the pressures of neighboring states, and the challenges of the highland environment. They had established a way of life, a set of shared practices, and a memory of themselves as distinct from the peoples around them. When future generations would write their histories, the memory of these early settlements, these first villages in the hills of Canaan, would be elevated into the narrative of origin, the first chapters of a civilization that would endure through fire, exile, and conquest. Thus, the story of Israel in this early period is one of quiet persistence. The Merneptah Stele records their existence in a single line carved into stone, a note of destruction in the midst of a pharaoh's triumphal hymn. Yet the people themselves were not destroyed. They grew, they adapted, they persisted. The small communities scattered across the highlands represent the first tangible evidence of a people who would later forge kingdoms, codify laws, and maintain identity across centuries. They are the earliest Jews, defined not yet by monarchy or temple, but by shared culture, religion, and memory. They are the foundation upon which all subsequent history would be built. As we trace their path forward, it is this resilience, this ability to endure and adapt, that will define the trajectory of Jewish history. From these modest highland villages, through centuries of kings and exiles, the story of the Jews begins, quietly, deliberately, and indelibly. Here, in the absence of empire, amid the ashes of, by the beginning of the 11th century BCE, the highlands of Canaan had shifted from scattered, autonomous villages into a network of loosely affiliated tribal confederations. These groups, bound by kinship, shared language, ritual, and memory, began to recognize the need for leadership beyond the local household. The pressures of survival were no longer solely environmental or internal. Neighboring peoples, the Philistines along the coastal plain, the Amorites to the east, and the remnants of Canaanite city-states, posed a constant threat. In response, the tribes began to coalesce, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, a monarchy began to take shape. This was the beginning of what would later be remembered as the United Kingdom of Israel, a political and spiritual experiment in the Central Highlands that would echo through centuries. The first figure recorded as king is Saul, a man described in later texts as a shepherd elevated to leadership by both charisma and necessity. Though the archaeological record does not provide direct evidence of Saul's reign, indirect clues suggest that some form of centralized authority emerged around this time. Sites such as Khirbet Qeiyafa, located southwest of Jerusalem and excavated in the early 21st century, reveal fortified cities from around 1050 BC. These structures demonstrate sophisticated urban planning, standardized pottery, and evidence of centralized control over labor and resources, hallmarks of emerging statehood. The existence of such a site confirms that the highland communities were capable of organizing, defending, and administering more than just subsistence villages. These were communities with the ability to project power, however modestly, over their neighbors. Saul's reign, as reconstructed from biblical texts and supported by regional archaeology, was dominated by conflict with the Philistines, a maritime people who had settled along the southern coastal plains of Canaan. Their cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, were heavily fortified and had access to maritime trade, which gave them economic and military advantages. The Philistines were technologically advanced, evidenced by the introduction of iron weaponry in the region, which created a tactical challenge for the highland tribes. Saul's campaigns were a mixture of defense and limited offensive expeditions. While the textual record portrays him as the chosen king, the archaeological record tells a story of constant negotiation, raids, and the harsh reality of survival in a contested landscape. The highlands, though defensible, were resource-poor, requiring clever diplomacy and occasional military action to secure water, pasture, and trade. Following Saul, David emerges as a central figure in the historical and narrative memory of Israel. Around 1000 BCE, he is said to have captured Jerusalem, a city that at the time was a modest Jebusite settlement perched on a rocky hill. Archaeological evidence indicates that Jerusalem was inhabited during this period, though it was neither large nor heavily fortified. The conquest of such a site, whether through military prowess, alliance, or negotiation, provided a symbolic and strategic center for the nascent kingdom. David's choice of Jerusalem as the capital was deliberate. It occupied neutral territory between the northern and southern tribes, and its defensible position made it ideal for administration and worship. Over time, David's dynasty would be immortalized not just in scripture, but in later inscriptions, most notably the Tel Dan stele of the 9th century BCE, which refers to the House of David. Carved by an Aramean king, The stele confirms the existence of a Davidic dynasty independently of biblical sources, providing a rare and valuable extra-biblical verification of historical kingship. David's rule, while militarily oriented, also marked the beginning of statecraft in the highlands. Records suggest that he maintained alliances through marriage, diplomacy, and tribute, ensuring that neighboring tribes were integrated or subdued. The tribal confederation gradually evolved into a more cohesive political entity, with Jerusalem serving as both a religious and administrative nucleus. Archaeological finds, such as storage facilities and urban construction projects in sites associated with his reign, indicate centralized control over resources, which would have been necessary to support military campaigns and urban development. Under David, Israel began to shift from a network of loosely affiliated tribes to a structured society capable of sustaining a monarchy. The reign of Solomon, David's son, represents the apogee of this early kingdom. While historical debates continue regarding the scale of his projects, evidence from regional trade networks, architecture, and inscriptions points to a period of significant political consolidation. Solomon is traditionally credited with building the first temple in Jerusalem, a structure that would serve as the spiritual heart of the Israelite religion for centuries. The temple symbolized centralized worship, bringing together various tribal deities under the patronage of a single god, Yahweh, and establishing a focal point for ritual practice. Archaeological evidence for the temple itself remains limited, but the urban development of Jerusalem during this period, such as fortifications, administrative buildings, and large storage complexes, supports the notion of a centralized and organized state. Trade flourished under Solomon, connecting the kingdom to Phoenicia, Arabia, and beyond. Imported goods, including ivory, timber, and exotic animals, have been discovered in sites dating to this era, suggesting both wealth and extensive international connections. These economic networks allowed the kingdom to sustain large-scale building projects, fund military ventures, and maintain a class of scribes and administrators. Solomon's court, as recorded in later texts, was not merely a political hub but a center of culture, law, and learning, reflecting the synthesis of local traditions with influences from surrounding civilizations. The kingdom at this moment achieved a precarious balance, strong enough to command respect and engage in international diplomacy, yet still fragile in the face of internal division and external threat. Solomon's death around 930 BCE marked a turning point. Political unity fractured under the pressures of succession, economic strain, and tribal rivalries. The kingdom was split into two, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The northern kingdom, richer and more expansive, encompassed fertile valleys and multiple urban centers. The southern kingdom, more defensible yet less populous, centered around Jerusalem and the highlands of Judah. This division would define the political landscape of the region for the next several centuries, and set the stage for patterns of conquest, exile, and cultural preservation that would become central to Jewish history. The significance of this period is not merely political. It is during the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon that the foundational elements of Jewish culture begin to take shape. Centralized worship, codification of laws, tribal consolidation, and the establishment of dynastic leadership all emerge in these decades. Archaeology confirms elements of urbanization, trade, and fortification, while inscriptions and extra-biblical sources verify the existence of dynasties and alliances. Together, these lines of evidence create a coherent picture of a people moving from fragmented tribal existence toward organized statehood, laying the structural and cultural groundwork for the centuries that follow. Religion, identity, and memory are intertwined with politics in this era. The notion of a covenantal relationship between a people and their deity begins to solidify. Altars, ritual sites, and sacrificial remains from the highlands indicate emerging practices of worship that emphasized both communal and personal piety. The codification of laws and oral traditions under royal patronage would later evolve into the texts that form the Hebrew Bible. These elements demonstrate that even as kings wielded temporal power, a parallel development was underway. The shaping of a collective identity that would survive the vicissitudes of history, preserved not in walls or armies, but in memory, law, and ritual. The birth of the kingdom also brings into focus the role of conflict and diplomacy in shaping identity. Military campaigns, alliances with neighboring states, and engagement with mercantile networks were all vital to survival. The northern and southern kingdoms, though culturally linked, would eventually follow divergent paths due to geography, resources, and political decisions. Israel, with its fertile lands and multiple cities, attracted foreign attention and ultimately fell to Assyrian conquest. Judah, with its defensible hills and centralized worship, would survive longer, preserving traditions and dynastic lines that would inform later Jewish history. These divergent trajectories highlight the interplay between environment, politics, and culture in the formation of identity. By 930 BCE, the central highlands of Canaan were no longer merely a collection of villages. They had become the stage for kingship, administration, religious centralization, and cultural innovation. The period between 1050 and 930 BCE, spanning Saul, David, and Solomon, represents the emergence of the first identifiable Jewish kingdom, blending political necessity with spiritual development. It is a time of ambition, conquest, diplomacy, and faith, a crucible in which the enduring identity of a people was forged. Here, history moves from the quiet resilience of highland villages into the legacy of this era is visible not only in texts and inscriptions, but in the very land itself. Excavated cities, fortifications, and ritual sites provide physical testimony to a society moving toward complex organization. The archaeological record, when read alongside historical texts, tells a story of a people simultaneously engaged in survival, statecraft, and cultural self-definition. The figures of Saul, David, and Solomon may be wrapped in legend, yet beneath the narrative, there is evidence of genuine political and social structures capable of sustaining a nascent kingdom. Their reigns and the institutions they established resonate far beyond their own lifetimes, influencing the development of law, worship, and identity for generations to come. In this way, the period between 1050 and 930 BCE is more than a chronological marker. It is the emergence of a civilization whose story would be retold, contested, and preserved across centuries. From the scattered villages of the highlands to the fortified city of Jerusalem, from tribal confederations to centralized kingship, the early kingdom of Israel represents the crystallization of culture, faith, and political organization. It is here, in these decades of ambition, diplomacy, and ritual, that the foundations of Jewish history are laid, a foundation built on endurance, memory, and the unyielding determination of a people to survive and define themselves in the midst of a turbulent world. By the year 930 BCE, the fragile unity of the Israelite kingdom had fractured. The dream of a single monarch uniting the tribes of the Central Highlands was no more. Political tension, economic disparity, and geographic separation conspired to create two distinct kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The northern kingdom, rich in fertile valleys and strategically placed trade routes, comprised a confederation of cities such as Shechem, Samaria, and Jezreel. Judah, smaller and more defensible, was centered around Jerusalem and the surrounding highlands, where the royal line of David would continue and the temple would serve as the spiritual core of Jewish identity. This bifurcation of power set the stage for divergent destinies, shaping the trajectory of Jewish history for centuries. The northern kingdom, often called the Kingdom of Israel, enjoyed relative prosperity. Archaeological evidence points to urban development, monumental architecture, and active engagement in regional trade. Excavations at Samaria, the capital founded by King Omri in the 9th century BCE, reveal a city of considerable scale. Fortified walls, palaces, and administrative buildings suggest a centralized authority capable of mobilizing resources and manpower. The city's ivory carvings, found in royal residences, indicate connections with Phoenician artisans and other Mediterranean cultures, reflecting a cosmopolitan, outward-looking elite. Yet prosperity came with vulnerability. The Northern Kingdom's wealth, accessibility, and exposure made it a prime target for powerful empires seeking tribute, loyalty, or conquest. The Assyrian Empire, ascending in the 9th century BCE, turned its attention toward Israel. Kings such as Shalmaneser III meticulously recorded campaigns against Israelite rulers. The Black Obelisk, a monumental Assyrian artifact, depicts King Jehu of Israel bowing in submission, delivering tribute to Shalmaneser III. This visual record, combined with Assyrian annals, provides undeniable extra-biblical evidence of Israelite political activity and its subjugation under imperial pressures. It is a stark reminder that the Northern Kingdom, for all its wealth and sophistication, existed in a precarious geopolitical environment, caught between ambitious empires and internal divisions. Internally, the Northern Kingdom grappled with the challenges of political cohesion. Unlike Judah, which retained the symbolic authority of the Davidic line and the religious center of Jerusalem, Israel's monarchy was less anchored by dynastic or spiritual legitimacy. Frequent coups, assassinations, and dynastic changes characterized the northern throne. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and seals from Samaria, corroborates the existence of multiple dynasties within a short span, reflecting instability at the highest levels of governance. This instability, combined with external threats, ultimately weakened Israel's ability to resist conquest. Meanwhile, Judah, though smaller and less economically vibrant, benefited from geography and continuity. Jerusalem, perched atop a rocky hill, was naturally defensible, and the Davidic line provided a sense of legitimacy and historical continuity. Religious centralization around the temple reinforced social cohesion, offering not only spiritual guidance, but also a framework for identity and law. The Southern Kingdom was less exposed to the immediate pressures of empire, and its rulers could consolidate power more effectively within a constrained territory. This combination of defensibility, tradition, and centralized worship allowed Judah to survive where Israel would eventually fall. By 722 BCE, the Northern Kingdom faced its ultimate test. The Assyrian Empire, under Tiglath-Pileser III and later Shalmaneser V, advanced into the Levant with unprecedented military organization. Archaeological surveys and Assyrian inscriptions confirm large-scale campaigns aimed at subduing Israel and enforcing tribute. The Assyrians employed mass deportations, relocating conquered populations to distant regions, a practice designed to prevent rebellion and assimilate subjugated peoples. Samaria fell, and the northern elite were exiled, effectively ending the independent Northern Kingdom. The historical event, catastrophic for Israel, left a lasting cultural and spiritual imprint. The 10 lost tribes became a symbol of exile and fragmentation, a motif that would resonate throughout Jewish memory. In the wake of Israel's destruction, Judah turned inward. Its survival depended on the preservation of identity through worship, law, and memory. The temple in Jerusalem, central to communal life, became not just a place of ritual, but a repository of cultural continuity. Priests, scribes, and prophets emerged as custodians of tradition, ensuring that even in the absence of political dominance, the people retained a coherent sense of themselves. Archaeological evidence from sites in Judah indicates continued settlement and fortification, suggesting that while Israel had fallen, Judah adapted strategically, reinforcing its towns and securing its borders against both external threats and internal dissent. Prophets played a critical role during this period. Figures such as Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah provided not only spiritual guidance, but also socio-political critique. Their messages often addressed injustice, corruption, and the perils of abandoning covenantal principles, warning both kingdoms of the consequences of moral and political failure. While the northern kingdom ultimately perished, these prophetic voices influenced Judah, contributing to the resilience and cohesion of the southern kingdom. Their writings, later incorporated into the Hebrew Bible, serve as both historical testimony and moral reflection, offering insight into the values, fears, and aspirations of the people during this turbulent era. Cultural and religious developments continued alongside political upheaval. The codification of oral traditions, ritual practices, and legal codes took shape in this period, laying the groundwork for later canonical texts. Archaeological finds, including inscriptions, altars, and cultic objects, suggest a complex religious life that combined ancestral customs with evolving notions of monotheism. In Judah, the centralization of worship in Jerusalem reinforced the identity of the people, ensuring that the collapse of Israel did not erase the traditions or spiritual cohesion of the broader Israelite population. Economically, both kingdoms faced distinct challenges. Israel, with its fertile plains, had thrived on agriculture and trade, but its wealth made it vulnerable to imperial exploitation. Judah, constrained by rocky terrain and a smaller population, relied on subsistence farming, herding, and localized trade. The southern kingdom's economic modesty, paradoxically, contributed to its durability. It avoided drawing excessive attention from external powers while sustaining internal cohesion. Archaeological evidence of terraced fields, storage facilities, and water cisterns illustrates a society adapted to its environment, capable of sustaining itself despite limited resources. The period between 930 and 722 BCE also saw the crystallization of social hierarchies. In Israel, monumental architecture, administrative seats. The story of the two kingdoms also illustrates the interplay of geography, politics, and culture in shaping historical outcomes. Israel's fertile valleys facilitated growth but exposed it to external conquest. Judah's rugged highlands limited expansion but provided defense. These environmental factors, combined with social, religious, and dynastic choices, determined the survival of one kingdom and the destruction of the other. The dichotomy between Israel and Judah, between vulnerability and resilience, would echo in the collective memory of the Jewish people for centuries, influencing theology, ritual, and identity. During these 2 centuries, Jewish identity, though politically fractured, became increasingly defined by shared law, ritual, and tradition. The prophets' warnings, the priest's codification of ritual, and the scribes' preservation of history ensured that the destruction of a kingdom did not equate to cultural erasure. By embedding memory into religious practice and text, the people of Judah created a system capable of withstanding conquest, displacement, and exile. Archaeology supports this. Sites across Judah reveal continued settlement, ritual activity, and material culture that reflects continuity despite political upheaval. As historians reflect on the period between 930 and 722 BCE, it becomes clear that the dual narrative of Israel and Judah is not simply a story of kings and conquest. It is a study in resilience, adaptation, and identity. The northern kingdom's prosperity and subsequent fall demonstrate the dangers of exposure and instability, while Judah's survival exemplifies the power of centralized worship, social cohesion, and strategic geography. Together, these twin narratives provide the framework for understanding the enduring character of the Jewish people, a civilization capable of surviving catastrophe without losing its sense of self. The legacy of this era is profound. The memory of the northern kingdom, its kings, cities, and people, persisted even after exile. Judah, carrying the torch of continuity, preserved religious and cultural traditions that would form the foundation of Judaism. The interplay of conquest and survival, wealth and vulnerability, faith and politics, all converge in this period to shape a historical consciousness that would resonate through the Babylonian exile, Persian restoration, and beyond. This duality, the rise and fall, the survival and memory, defines the contours of Jewish history in its earliest recorded forms. In the hills and valleys of the Levant, from Samaria to Jerusalem, the story of the Jews unfolds as a tale of divergence and endurance. The two kingdoms, born from a single unified monarchy, illustrate how geography, leadership, and culture interact to determine historical outcomes. The Northern Kingdom's tragic fate and Judah's cautious resilience provide not only historical lessons, but also the foundation for a civilization that would survive empire, exile, and centuries of displacement. Here, in these 2 centuries, the contours of Jewish history are etched into stone, soil, and memory, shaping the identity of a people whose story would continue for millennia. By the late 8th century BCE, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah faced a world increasingly dominated by imperial powers. The northern kingdom, Israel, had already succumbed to Assyrian conquest, leaving Judah as the last remnant of the united Israelite state. The southern kingdom, though fortified by rugged terrain and the enduring authority of the Davidic line, could not escape the tides of history. The Assyrians had reshaped the political landscape of the Levant, enforcing tribute, installing loyal governors, and deporting populations to prevent rebellion. Judah survived, but survival would demand adaptation, resilience, and a profound reimagining of identity in the centuries to come. By the beginning of the 7th century BCE, Judah experienced relative stability under kings such as Hezekiah and Josiah. Hezekiah fortified Jerusalem, constructed water tunnels, and reasserted loyalty to Yahweh as the central deity. Josiah, centuries later, undertook reforms that centralized worship and codified laws, demonstrating a kingdom deeply conscious of the fragility of sovereignty and the importance of cultural cohesion. Yet these measures could only delay the inevitable. The rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, under the ambitious and formidable Nebuchadnezzar II, posed a challenge that Jerusalem alone could not withstand. In 586 BCE, the forces of Babylon laid siege to Jerusalem. Archaeological evidence, including burned layers in the city, collapsed fortifications, and artifacts scattered by fire, confirms the destruction recorded by both biblical texts and Babylonian chronicles. The city fell, the temple, the heart of worship, national identity, and communal memory, was burned to the ground, and the population was deported to the banks of the rivers of Babylon. The Babylonian chronicles, such as the Babylonian Chronicle of Nebuchadnezzar, corroborate these events, recording the subjugation of Judah and the exile of its people. The destruction was total. Administrative structures, fortifications, and sacred spaces alike were obliterated, leaving the inhabitants to grapple with the dislocation of both body and spirit. The exile marked a profound transformation in Jewish identity. No longer anchored solely by territory or temple, the people were forced to carry their culture, law, and religion into a foreign land. In Babylon, the exiles confronted a sophisticated urban civilization, vastly different from the rural highlands of Judah. They encountered monumental ziggurats, extensive canals, marketplaces, and administrative networks, an environment at once alien and awe-inspiring. Amid these foreign landscapes, the Jews adapted. Synagogues, although not yet the centers of worship they would become centuries later, began to emerge as communal gathering places for prayer, instruction, and law. Religious practice became portable, law and memory became central, and the covenantal relationship with Yahweh was internalized rather than tied solely to a physical temple. The composition of texts during this period reflects this shift. Scholars suggest that significant portions of the Hebrew Bible, including prophetic works and historical narratives, were compiled, edited, and codified during exile. Psalms of lament, historical chronicles, and laws codified in Deuteronomic form provided structure, identity, and resilience. The exile necessitated a religion capable of surviving without temple, priest, or king, a faith rooted in text, law, and communal memory. This transformation would have lasting consequences, ensuring that Jewish identity could endure across centuries of displacement, persecution, and diaspora. The psychological and cultural impact of the exile cannot be overstated. Psalm 137, one of the most enduring literary testaments to this period, captures the profound sense of loss and longing. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. It is a declaration of mourning, but also of resilience. Despite displacement, the exiles preserved names, rituals, and memory. They adapted their social structures, maintained legal traditions, and transmitted language and identity across generations. The exile was not merely a catastrophe. It was a crucible, refining the people's sense of self and solidifying cultural cohesion. Archaeological evidence supports this cultural continuity. Clay tablets, administrative records, and inscriptions from Babylon reveal the presence of Jewish communities, their engagement in commerce, and their interaction with local authorities. They maintained familial and tribal structures, cultivated land when possible, and participated in the economic life of the empire while preserving distinct customs. The Jewish exiles were neither passive nor assimilated. They adapted, negotiated, and preserved identity in a land that sought to absorb them. The political context of the exile further emphasizes its transformative nature. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar II, pursued a policy of strategic deportations, relocating elites, artisans, and skilled laborers to distant provinces. This practice prevented rebellion and integrated conquered peoples into the empire's economic and administrative apparatus. For Judah, this meant that the ruling class, religious leaders, and scribes were uprooted, leaving a vacuum at home while planting seeds of influence abroad. These deported communities carried knowledge, traditions, and memory, establishing networks that would facilitate Jewish survival and eventual restoration. Religious innovation during exile extended to the reinterpretation of sacred space, ritual, and practice. Without the temple, rituals were adapted to the household and communal gathering. Prayer, study, and ethical observance took precedence. Law became central, codified and transmitted orally and textually, creating a framework that would survive the eventual return to Jerusalem and later diasporas. Exile transformed Judaism from a temple-centered cult into a portable religion of law, ethics, and memory, a system capable of sustaining identity across centuries and continents. The exile also prompted reflection on the reasons for national catastrophe. Prophets such as Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and 2nd Isaiah interpreted the destruction as divine judgment, emphasizing moral, ethical, and covenantal dimensions. Their writings, the exile also fostered cultural synthesis and intellectual growth. Exposure to Babylonian literature, law codes, and administration influenced Jewish thought, prompting reinterpretation and codification of legal and moral principles. Texts like the Deuteronomic Code reflect dialogue with neighboring legal traditions while affirming a unique covenantal ethic. In this crucible of displacement, Jewish identity became resilient, adaptable, and intellectually sophisticated, a combination that would allow survival under later empires, including Persia, Greece, and Rome. By 539 BCE, the Babylonian Empire fell to Cyrus the Great of Persia. His conquest marked the end of exile and the beginning of return, but the transformations wrought in Babylon would endure. The Jewish people emerged with a renewed sense of identity, firmly rooted in law, ritual, and text rather than solely in land or temple. The exile had tested and strengthened them, forging a civilization of memory capable of withstanding future dislocations. It is a testament to resilience, a people uprooted, scattered, and confronted with foreign dominance, yet capable of survival and renewal. The exile also shaped the collective memory that would inform Jewish historiography and self-perception for millennia. Songs of lament, accounts of destruction, and reflections on divine judgment created a framework for interpreting subsequent history. The memory of Babylon became a lens through which later generations understood conquest, exile, and restoration. Cultural practices, legal codification, and literary traditions developed in this period became foundational for the enduring identity of the Jewish people. Ultimately, the period between 722 and 539 BCE is one of profound transformation. The fall of Israel, the survival of Judah, and the Babylonian exile redefined the parameters of Jewish life, religion, and identity. Archaeology, inscriptions, and literary evidence converged to depict a people adapting to displacement, preserving cultural cohesion, and transforming their faith into a portable system capable of enduring across empires. The rivers of Babylon, once a site of mourning, became the crucible in which Judaism evolved from a regional temple-based cult into a resilient, text-centered civilization of memory and law. As history unfolded, the lessons of exile resonated far beyond the banks of the Euphrates. The experience would inform later interactions with Persian rulers, shape expectations of divine providence, and establish enduring patterns of law, ritual, and communal cohesion. From destruction came reflection, from exile came endurance. The Jews, uprooted from their homeland and temple, carried identity in language, law, and memory. Their civilization, forged under duress, emerged stronger, more adaptive, and deeply conscious of the fragility of earthly power and the durability of cultural and spiritual continuity. The narrative of exile is not merely historical, it is emblematic. It reveals a civilization capable of surviving catastrophe, preserving identity, and adapting to new realities without losing coherence. The destruction of Jerusalem, the burning of the temple, and the deportation to Babylon were not endpoints but transformative moments. They forged a people capable of surviving an empire, shaping memory, codifying law, and preparing for eventual restoration. This period spanning 722 to 539 BC represents a pivotal chapter in the history of the Jews, a crucible in which identity, faith, and culture were tested and preserved, ensuring that even in the absence of a homeland, the people endured. In 539 BCE, the world of the ancient Near East shifted once again. The mighty Neo-Babylonian Empire, which had uprooted the people of Judah and carried them to the banks of the rivers of Babylon, fell to the rising power of Persia under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was not merely a conqueror. He was a ruler with a revolutionary approach to governance. Unlike his predecessors, who relied on sheer force and repression to maintain dominion, Cyrus sought to integrate conquered peoples by respecting their customs, religions, and local authority. Among the many peoples under Babylonian rule, the Jews were afforded a unique opportunity, the chance to return to their homeland and rebuild their shattered city and temple. The policy itself is recorded on the Cyrus cylinder, an inscribed clay artifact that survives as one of the most remarkable documents of ancient diplomacy. The cylinder details Cyrus' decree permitting exiled peoples to return home and restore sacred sites. For the Jewish people, this decree was not merely administrative, it was epical. After nearly half a century in Babylon, entire generations had grown up far from the hills of Judah, learning to live as strangers in a foreign land. The return was both a political act and a spiritual homecoming, a reclamation of identity forged in exile. The journey back to Judah was arduous. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that the returning exiles traveled in waves, guided by leaders and priests who sought to re-establish worship, law, and community. Jerusalem, when they arrived, was a city in ruins. Its walls lay in rubble, its temple burned and desecrated, and its fields abandoned or overgrown. Yet, the returning exiles were not passive mourners. They were builders, reconstructing a city with scant resources but abundant determination. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, along with contemporary Persian records, document the arduous efforts to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, re-establish civic order, and restore ritual life at the Second Temple. The Second Temple, though more modest in scale than Solomon's original, represented the spiritual heart of the returning community. It was a focal point not only for worship, but also for social cohesion. Priests and scribes resumed their roles as guardians of law, ritual, and memory. The sacred texts that had been preserved and edited during the Babylonian exile were compiled and standardized, forming the foundations of the Hebrew Bible as we know it today. Legal and ritual codification became central to the life of the community. Observances, festivals, and sacrifices were carefully regulated to maintain continuity with the past, ensuring that even in a time of political subordination under Persian rule, cultural and religious identity remained intact. The Persian administration facilitated this restoration by allowing local governance while asserting imperial oversight. Persian satraps oversaw provinces like Judah, but local leaders, including priestly authorities, had autonomy in religious and civic matters. This arrangement allowed the Jewish people to rebuild their institutions and practice their faith while remaining under the protection of one of history's largest empires. The interplay between local autonomy and imperial oversight created a delicate balance that would shape the social and political structures of Jewish life for centuries. Economically, the returning exiles faced the challenge of re-establishing livelihoods in a land devastated by decades of war, neglect, and depopulation. Archaeological evidence indicates that they worked to restore agriculture, rebuild irrigation systems, and reclaim abandoned fields. Tax records and administrative documents from the Persian period reveal that Judah contributed to the empire's economy while maintaining local production and trade. Despite the hardships, the community stabilized, demonstrating resilience and adaptability in the face of environmental, political, and social challenges. Socially, the return to Judah was not without tension. Generations had been born in Babylon, while others remembered the pre-exilic kingdom. These differences created divisions over land, leadership, and religious practice. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah record disputes between returning exiles and those who had remained in the land, including debates over intermarriage, priestly appointments, and communal governance. These conflicts highlight the complexities of restoring a society that had been fractured both physically and culturally. The process of reintegration was as much about negotiating memory, identity, and law as it was about rebuilding walls and temples. The religious innovations that emerged during this period were profound. Without the grandeur of Solomon's temple or the political power of a Davidic monarchy, the Jewish people turned inward, emphasizing law, study, and ethical observance. The Torah became central, serving as both spiritual guide and legal framework. Priestly and scribal classes assumed leadership roles, ensuring that adherence to covenantal laws would unite the community even in the absence of political sovereignty. Festivals such as Passover, Sukkot, and Yom Kippur were observed with renewed rigor, reinforcing collective memory and cultural cohesion. Cultural exchange with the Persian Empire also influenced Jewish thought and administration. Exposure to Persian governance, legal codes, and religious ideas informed the organizational structure of Jewish society. The practice of recording decrees, maintaining genealogies, and codifying law reflected both continuity with ancient traditions and adaptation to imperial models. These innovations strengthened the community. Education and literacy played increasingly important roles. Scribes trained in reading, writing, and law ensured that religious and historical knowledge could be transmitted across generations. Archives of records, genealogies, and legal decisions allowed the community to maintain cohesion and continuity. This focus on literacy and textual preservation would become a hallmark of Jewish civilization, enabling cultural survival through subsequent periods of upheaval, including Hellenistic and Roman domination. The restoration of Jerusalem and the Second Temple also reinforced communal morale and spiritual identity. Archaeological evidence confirms the reconstruction of city walls, fortifications, and public spaces during this period, reflecting a deliberate effort to create a functional and symbolic capital. The temple served as a center not only for sacrifice but also for education, law, and administration. It was both a physical and symbolic anchor, linking the exiled generations to their ancestral past, while orienting the community toward a future of continuity and resilience. The influence of the Persian model extended to governance and diplomacy. Jewish leaders, operating under the authority of Persian satraps, learned to navigate imperial bureaucracy, manage local disputes, and administer civic and religious life. This experience fostered adaptability, pragmatism, and organizational skill, qualities that would serve Jewish communities in subsequent encounters with foreign empires. By learning to operate within a larger imperial framework, the Jewish people strengthened their ability to preserve autonomy, identity, and culture in the absence of full sovereignty. Religious scholarship flourished during this period. Priests and scribes dedicated themselves to the compilation and editing of texts, ensuring that law, prophecy, and history were recorded for posterity. The stories of exile, conquest, and return were codified, creating a narrative framework that explained suffering, justified survival, and offered guidance for future generations. This textual tradition, rooted in lived experience and historical memory, became the foundation of Judaism as a religion of law, ethics, and enduring identity. By the end of the Persian period, Judah had been transformed. No longer an independent monarchy, it had become a community of law, ritual, and memory, capable of surviving under foreign domination. The restoration of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the Second Temple, and the codification of sacred texts ensured that Jewish identity would endure. The lessons of exile, adaptation, preservation, and resilience were now embedded in the culture, preparing the community for future encounters with Hellenistic and Roman powers. The period between 539 and 332 BCE is therefore a story of reconstruction and transformation. It is a story of people returning to a land in ruins and, through faith, law, and collective effort, rebuilding not only structures but a civilization. Archaeology, Persian records, and biblical texts converge to confirm this era of revival, demonstrating the adaptability, resourcefulness, and enduring spirit of the Jewish people. The return from Babylon was not merely a physical journey, but a profound reconstitution of identity, culture, and spiritual life. The legacy of this era resonates across centuries. By anchoring identity in law, text, and ritual rather than solely in monarchy or temple grandeur, the Jewish people ensured continuity in the face of future conquest, exile, and dispersion. The Second Temple period laid the groundwork for subsequent developments under Hellenistic and Roman rule, including the emergence of sects, prophetic movements, and messianic expectations. The civilization that emerged from the Babylonian exile and Persian restoration was both resilient and reflective, capable of sustaining memory, faith, and law across centuries and continents. The story of return and restoration, therefore, is not only a tale of rebuilding walls and temples, but of reconstructing society, preserving memory, and redefining identity. It is the moment when Judaism, shaped by exile, emerged as a portable civilization of law, ethics, and ritual. From the ruins of Jerusalem to the Persian imperial court, the Jewish people demonstrated a capacity for resilience that would define their history for millennia. The reconstruction of Jerusalem, the codification of law, and the preservation of memory during this period ensured that the lessons of exile were internalized and that identity was secured not by land or king, but by covenant community and text. In 332 BCE, the ancient world was once again on the cusp of transformation. Alexander the Great, the young Macedonian king whose campaigns had already toppled the Persian Empire, swept through the Levant. His army, disciplined, vast, and relentless, moved southward from Phoenicia into the lands of Judah. The Persian satraps, weakened by decades of imperial overstretch, could not resist his advance. For the Jewish people, this was a moment of sudden exposure to a world far larger than any they had known under Persian rule, a world dominated by Hellenistic culture, Greek language, and new political paradigms. The conquest was swift. Jerusalem surrendered without bloodshed, its leaders calculating that cooperation with the new power offered survival and opportunity. Hellenism, the spread of Greek culture, language, art, and political ideas, was not merely a matter of aesthetics or philosophy. It was a social and political force that reshaped the regions it touched. Greek became the language of administration, commerce, and intellectual life. Cities adopted Greek architectural forms, theaters, gymnasiums, and temples dedicated to a pantheon of gods from Zeus to Athena. Coins, inscriptions, and monumental buildings reflected the fusion of politics and culture. For the Jews, this presented a challenge and an opportunity: how to maintain the sanctity of Yahweh, the traditions of law, and the authority of the temple while negotiating the pervasive influence of Hellenistic culture. Alexander's death in 323 BCE shattered his empire, dividing it among his generals, the Diadochi. Judea fell under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, which ruled from Alexandria, before later coming under the Seleucid Empire. Both dynasties imposed Greek administrative structures and patronized the spread of Hellenistic culture, yet each approached local governance differently. The Ptolemies, pragmatic and focused on economic exploitation, allowed considerable autonomy for Jewish institutions, seeing compliance as sufficient to maintain order. In contrast, the Seleucids, particularly under kings like Antiochus III and Antiochus IV, would later challenge the very foundations of Jewish religious life, leading to tension, cultural conflict, and ultimately revolt. Under Hellenistic rule, Jewish society became increasingly diverse. Urban centers such as Jerusalem and later other towns influenced by Greek culture became sites of cultural exchange. Wealthy elites often adopted Greek customs, language, and dress, seeking status and opportunity within the Hellenistic system. Gymnasiums became sites of education, physical training, and social networking for young men, while Greek-style theaters and festivals offered cultural spectacle. This process of assimilation created tension between traditionalists, who sought to preserve religious purity and adherence to Torah law, and Hellenized Jews, who embraced aspects of Greek life. These cultural fault lines would shape social and political dynamics for decades to come. Religious life, too, was affected by the encounter with Hellenism. The Jewish temple in Jerusalem remained central, yet Greek ideas, rituals, and even architecture began to influence practices and perceptions. Some priests and community leaders saw Hellenization as a path to prestige and prosperity. Others perceived it as a threat to covenantal fidelity and cultural survival. Philosophical exchanges, debates over law, and the translation of sacred texts into Greek the Septuagint, reflected both the accommodation and tension of this period. The Jewish people, once isolated in the highlands of Judah, now found themselves at the crossroads of Mediterranean intellectual, religious, and political currents. The tension between Greek rulers and Jewish tradition reached its apex under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, r. 175 to 164 BCE. Seeking to consolidate authority, impose uniformity, and integrate Judea fully into the Hellenistic world, he attempted to suppress Jewish religious practice. In 167 BCE, he desecrated the temple, installing a statue of Zeus atop the altar and banning the observation of Torah law. The prohibition against circumcision, dietary law, and Sabbath observance ignited outrage among the population. This was not merely a conflict of politics. It was a confrontation between competing worldviews, the universalizing Hellenistic state and the covenantal, monotheistic traditions of the Jews. The rededication of the temple symbolized more than the restoration of ritual. It represented the assertion of Jewish identity in the face of external pressure, the triumph of cultural survival over political domination. The Hasmonean revolt and its aftermath illustrate the interplay between religion, culture, and political power. Coins, inscriptions, and architectural remnants from this period testify to renewed sovereignty, cultural resilience, and the complex negotiation between tradition and adaptation. The revolt was both a religious and a political act, a defense of monotheism, law, and collective memory against imperial homogenization. Following the revolt, the Hasmonean dynasty established a period of semi-independent rule, blending priestly authority with political power. This era saw the expansion of territory, the consolidation of Jewish law, and the maintenance of cultural practices in the face of external influence. Hellenistic culture continued to permeate the region, but the Hasmoneans demonstrated that adaptation need not equal assimilation. Greek language, art, and governance could coexist with covenantal fidelity, creating a hybrid civilization that navigated the pressures of empire without surrendering identity. Coins minted by the Hasmoneans, inscriptions in both Hebrew and Greek, and the archaeological remains of fortified cities attest to the sophistication and resilience of this society. The Hasmonean period also highlights the tension between urban and rural communities, between the Hellenized elite and the Torah-observant populace. Cities such as Jerusalem became centers of administration, ritual, and trade, while rural highlands preserved older patterns of worship, social organization, and communal memory. This duality reflects the broader challenge of sustaining identity under cultural pressure, negotiating modernity without forfeiting tradition. It is a lesson in resilience, strategy, and the careful calibration of assimilation and resistance that would characterize Jewish history for centuries to come. Education, law, and textual preservation continued to be central. The Torah, previously consolidated during the Babylonian exile and Persian restoration, became increasingly codified and interpreted to guide daily life. Scribes and scholars, now operating in a world influenced by Greek ideas of governance, ethics, and philosophy, ensured that Jewish law remained relevant, coherent, and binding. This period reinforced the idea that identity and survival depended not solely on territory or temple, but on law, text, and communal cohesion, a theme that would resonate through Roman rule and beyond. The encounter with Hellenism was also intellectually stimulating. Exposure to Greek thought, including philosophy, literature, and political theory, encouraged reflection, debate, and adaptation. Jewish scholars and leaders engaged selectively, adopting administrative techniques, military strategies, and cultural forms while resisting theological compromise. The result was a dynamic society capable of participating in a broader cultural sphere while retaining a distinct identity. The translation of texts into Greek facilitated communication and integration but also preserved the Jewish narrative for a wider audience, laying the groundwork for centuries of diaspora engagement. By the conclusion of this period, around 164 BCE, the Jewish people had survived, adapted, and even thrived amid cultural and political upheaval. They had weathered foreign conquest, negotiated the pressures of Hellenistic assimilation, and defended their religious and cultural identity through revolt and careful leadership. The rededication of the temple, the establishment of the Hasmonean dynasty, and the continued codification of law all reflect a civilization of memory, a people acutely aware of the fragility of sovereignty, yet committed to enduring through faith, ritual, and communal solidarity. The period between 332 and 164 BCE illustrates the interplay between empire and identity, culture and faith, coercion and adaptation. It reveals people negotiating the forces of history with strategic acumen and cultural resilience. Alexander's conquests, the policies of the Ptolemies and Seleucids, and the eventual Hasmonean revolt show that survival required both pragmatic adaptation to external powers and uncompromising fidelity to core values. Archaeology, coins, inscriptions, and literary evidence converge to tell a story of resistance, synthesis, and enduring identity, a civilization caught between the universality of Zeus and the covenantal particularity of Yahweh. In reflecting on this era, one sees the foundations of what would later become a global civilization of diaspora, law, and faith. The strategies developed during the Hellenistic period, maintaining identity under foreign rule, codifying law, and balancing adaptation and resistance, would inform Jewish survival through the Roman period and beyond. It is a testament to the resilience, creativity, and foresight of a people determined to endure, to preserve memory, and to navigate the tides of empire without losing the essence of who they were. The encounter with Hellenism, therefore, was transformative. It was not a simple story of conquest or oppression, but of cultural negotiation, adaptation, and renewal. Jewish society during this period demonstrates how identity can be preserved and even strengthened under external pressure. Through law, ritual, revolt, and selective assimilation, the people of Judah maintained continuity, ensured survival, and prepared for the next chapter of their history under the looming power of Rome. Between 332 and 164 BCE, the Jews navigated a world dominated by Alexander's legacy, Hellenistic culture, and imperial ambition, emerging not merely intact, but with a more sophisticated, adaptable, and resilient civilization, capable of enduring whatever the future would hold. By 164 BCE, after years of brutal conflict against Seleucid oppression, the Jewish people achieved a rare and extraordinary feat. They reclaimed their sacred city of Jerusalem, restored the temple to proper worship, and established a ruling dynasty entirely of their own making. This was the dawn of the Hasmonean realm, a period that would last for a century, marked by the extraordinary convergence of priestly authority, political power, and military ambition. It was an era that would redefine Jewish sovereignty, expand territory, and create a precedent for self-rule in a world dominated by empires. The Hasmoneans, descendants of the priestly family of Mattathias and Judah Maccabee, faced the monumental task of transforming a community that had survived decades under foreign rule into a functioning state. Jerusalem, while symbolically restored, remained a city of ruins in many respects. Its walls were damaged, its economy fragile, and its social fabric frayed. Yet the Hasmoneans, through strategic leadership, military campaigns, and diplomatic maneuvering, began to consolidate their authority and extend their control over Judea and the surrounding regions. They fused religious and political power in a way that had not been seen since the Davidic kings, positioning themselves as both high priests and sovereign rulers. This combination of priesthood and monarchy, unprecedented and fraught with challenges, became a defining feature of their reign. The early Hasmonean rulers, including Simon Thassi and his brother Jonathan, faced constant threats both internally and externally. Neighboring Hellenistic kingdoms, while weakened, still harbored ambitions of regional dominance. Local populations remained divided. Some were loyal to the Hasmonean cause, committed to Torah observance and cultural revival, while others preferred accommodation with Hellenistic rulers and had embraced elements of Greek culture. Navigating these divisions required both military skill and political acumen. The Hasmoneans leveraged strategic alliances, religious authority, and the mobilization of popular support to solidify control. Territorial expansion became a hallmark of the Hasmonean era. Unlike the earlier Davidic and Solomonic kingdoms, which had been limited in scope, the Hasmoneans actively campaigned to bring the surrounding regions under their control. Archaeological evidence, inscriptions, and contemporary accounts indicate the annexation of territories in Galilee, Samaria, Idumea, and beyond. These campaigns were often justified through a combination of religious, political, and strategic reasoning. Unifying the people under the covenant of Yahweh, securing borders against hostile neighbors, and ensuring economic resources to sustain the growing state. The expansion of the realm reinforced the Hasmonean claim to legitimacy and provided the resources necessary for both civic development and religious restoration. The Hasmoneans also undertook ambitious building projects. Jerusalem's walls were reconstructed and fortified, marketplaces and administrative centers were established, and new fortresses were constructed in strategic locations. Coins minted during this period reflect both Hellenistic influences and distinctly Jewish symbolism. Inscriptions in Hebrew proclaiming sovereignty, symbols of priestly authority, and images reflecting military victory. These tangible artifacts testify to a society conscious of its place in the wider world, aware of the need to project power, authority, and cultural identity simultaneously. Religious life during the Hasmonean period was the Hasmoneans also faced challenges from within their own society. Divisions over Hellenization persisted, with some urban elites favoring Greek customs, language, and education, while rural communities adhered strictly to Torah law and traditional practices. The dynasty navigated these tensions by selectively adopting Hellenistic administrative and military techniques while emphasizing religious orthodoxy. This pragmatic approach allowed the Hasmoneans to maintain legitimacy among diverse constituencies and consolidate their authority, though it also sowed seeds of future dissent and factionalism. Diplomacy played a critical role in Hasmonean strategy. Surrounded by larger Hellenistic powers, the Hasmoneans negotiated alliances, truces, and marriages to secure their borders and strengthen their political position. They maintained relations with Egypt and other regional actors, leveraging both religious and military influence to project power. These diplomatic efforts demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of geopolitics, recognizing that survival and sovereignty depended as much on negotiation and strategy as on force of arms. Military prowess was essential to Hasmonean survival. Armies were raised, trained, and deployed to defend the realm and expand its borders. Campaigns were conducted with a combination of guerrilla tactics, traditional battle formations, and strategic sieges, reflecting lessons learned during the Maccabean revolt. The Hasmoneans understood that legitimacy depended not only on religious authority, but also on the ability to defend the kingdom from external threats. Victory in battle reinforced their claim to rule, projected power to neighboring territories, and secured resources critical to sustaining both civic and religious life. Culturally, the Hasmonean period represents a fascinating synthesis of Jewish tradition and Hellenistic influence. While Greek language, coinage, and architectural motifs were adopted in certain contexts, the dynasty emphasized Hebrew as the language of administration and religion. Festivals, rituals, and law codification reinforced identity, while selective adaptation of Hellenistic models allowed the kingdom to function effectively in a broader imperial context. This balance between continuity and adaptation became a model for later Jewish communities navigating the pressures of empire, demonstrating the capacity to absorb external influences without forfeiting cultural and religious integrity. The Hasmonean realm also set precedents for governance that would influence subsequent periods. The fusion of religious and political authority established a model of leadership that combined moral, legal, and military responsibilities. Bureaucratic structures developed to manage taxation, trade, and civic affairs reflected a sophisticated understanding of statecraft. Leaders were expected not only to defend the realm, but also to uphold religious law, arbitrate disputes, and maintain social cohesion. This integration of governance and faith reinforced stability while creating a framework for civic and religious life that endured even after the fall of Hasmonean rule. Despite these successes, the Hasmonean dynasty faced persistent internal and external pressures. Civil wars erupted, succession disputes undermined authority, and the ambitions of neighboring powers threatened stability. The kingdom's reliance on a hereditary priestly monarchical system, while effective in consolidating early authority, ultimately created vulnerabilities. The blending of religious and political power provoked rivalries and factionalism that would later be exploited by external actors, notably the rising Roman Republic, which sought influence in the region. By 63 BCE, the Hasmonean realm, though impressive in its achievements, could no longer withstand the pressures of internal division and external ambition. Pompey the Great, the Roman general, entered Jerusalem, asserting Roman dominance over Judea. The Hasmonean dynasty's sovereignty was curtailed, and Judea became a client kingdom under Rome. The centuries of independent Jewish rule, marked by religious revival, territorial expansion, and political innovation, were brought to an end. Yet the legacy of the Hasmoneans endured. The structures of governance, law, ritual, and cultural identity they developed would shape Jewish life under Roman rule and influence future generations of leaders, scholars, and communities. The century of Hasmonean rule illustrates the complex interplay of religion, politics, culture, and military power. It was an era in which a displaced and beleaguered people reclaimed sovereignty, forged a hybrid civilization, and navigated the pressures of empire with ingenuity and resilience. Archaeological evidence, from coins and fortresses to inscriptions and temple remnants, attests to the sophistication, ambition, and adaptability of the Hasmonean state. This period demonstrates that survival, identity, and cultural continuity require not only faith and memory, but also strategic vision, political acumen, and the capacity to balance tradition with innovation. The Hasmonean era also reinforces the enduring theme of memory in Jewish history. The reclamation of Jerusalem, the rededication of the temple, and the establishment of an independent realm were acts rooted in remembrance of a distant past. The Davidic monarchy, the covenant with Yahweh, and the cultural heritage preserved through exile. Each conquest, restoration, and reform was imbued with historical consciousness, a recognition that identity is maintained not only through present achievements, but through continuity with the past. The Hasmoneans understood that legitimacy rested on this link between history, law, and leadership. Ultimately, the Hasmonean period, spanning from 164 to 63 BCE, is a story of extraordinary resilience, innovation, and adaptation. It demonstrates how a community, forged in exile and tested under foreign domination, can reclaim sovereignty, develop sophisticated political and religious structures, and negotiate the challenges of empire without losing its identity. The achievements of the Hasmonean rulers, though ultimately curtailed by Roman expansion, laid the foundations for Jewish survival, continuity, and cultural resilience in the centuries to follow. The story of the Hasmoneans reminds us that history is not merely a series of events, but a complex interplay of memory, identity, power, and faith. It is a narrative of a people who, even after centuries of conquest and exile, could rise to reclaim their homeland, rebuild their institutions, and assert a distinctive civilization in the heart of the ancient world. The Hasmonean realm was, in every sense, both a culmination of the struggles of the past and a preparation for the trials that lay ahead under Roman rule. Its legacy endures in law, ritual, literature, and collective memory, marking a defining chapter in the history of the Jews. By 63 BCE, the centuries of Jewish sovereignty under the Hasmonean dynasty had come to a decisive turning point. Pompey the Great, the Roman general and architect of Mediterranean conquest, entered Jerusalem, asserting Rome's authority over Judea. The Hasmoneans, who had ruled a semi-independent realm for a century, were reduced to vassals, their autonomy curtailed but their identity intact. For the Jewish people, this marked the beginning of a new era, one under the shadow of the Roman eagle, yet defined by resilience, adaptation, and the unyielding preservation of law, ritual, and memory. The land of Judea would remain theirs, yet they were now citizens of a larger imperial framework, subjected to distant rulers who understood power in terms of legions, taxation, and dominance. Rome, ever pragmatic in its approach to governance, installed client kings to maintain order. Among them, Herod the Great, appointed king of Judea in 37 BCE, would become one of history's most enigmatic and controversial figures. Herod was a man of ambition, cunning, and ruthlessness, tasked with preserving peace in a volatile region while satisfying the demands of Rome. His architectural projects were monumental. He expanded the Second Temple in Jerusalem into a structure of unprecedented grandeur, constructed fortresses like Masada, and built cities reflecting Hellenistic and Roman tastes. Yet beneath the marble and gilding, resentment simmered among the Jewish populace. Herod's loyalty to Rome, his idiosyncratic adherence to Jewish law, and his ruthless suppression of dissent created an atmosphere of tension that would only intensify in the following decades. Beneath the surface of imperial control, the Jewish people maintained a vibrant religious and social life. Sectarian movements flourished, each interpreting the Torah and Jewish law in unique ways. The Pharisees emphasized strict adherence to law, ritual purity, and the evolving oral traditions. The Sadducees, often aligned with priestly authority and the temple elite, favored a more conservative, temple-centered approach. The Essenes, living in isolated communities such as Qumran, devoted themselves to asceticism, ritual purity, and preservation of sacred texts. These movements were not mere theological debates. They reflected the broader struggle of a people attempting to preserve identity, law, and memory under the pressure of imperial domination and cultural exchange. The Roman imposition, the growing tension between Roman authority and Jewish expectation eventually erupted into open revolt. In 66 CE, widespread dissatisfaction, sparked by taxation, corruption, and religious provocation, led to the First Jewish Revolt. Communities across Judea mobilized, forming militias and challenging Roman garrisons. The revolt was a test of endurance and strategy, pitting local knowledge, religious fervor, and popular support against the disciplined, professional Roman legions. The Jewish fighters, motivated by both spiritual conviction and a longing for independence, demonstrated remarkable resilience, holding Jerusalem and surrounding fortresses against a superior military force for several years. The Roman response was decisive. Vespasian, and later his son Titus, led legions into Judea with overwhelming force. They besieged cities, destroyed fortifications, and methodically dismantled resistance. By 70 CE, Roman strategy culminated in the siege of Jerusalem, the spiritual and administrative heart of the Jewish people. The Second Temple, the center of religious life for centuries and the symbol of covenantal continuity, was burned to the ground. Josephus, a Jewish historian who had witnessed the devastation, described the destruction in stark terms. The temple was burned to the ground, and the city fell silent, its people scattered and mourning the end of an era. This moment was not only a military defeat, but a profound spiritual and cultural trauma, the consequences of which would reverberate across generations. The destruction of the Second Temple represented a turning point in Jewish history. It was more than a building. It was the focal point of worship, the heart of civic and spiritual life, and a repository of communal memory. With its destruction, Jewish practice had to be reimagined. Religious authority shifted from the temple and priesthood to local synagogues, scribes, and rabbinic scholars. Texts, law, and ritual, once centered on a physical locus, became portable, adaptable, and resilient. The Torah, oral law, and the emerging rabbinic tradition provided a framework for identity and continuity in the absence of political sovereignty or a central sanctuary. The social impact of the revolt and its suppression was profound. Populations were decimated, urban centers destroyed, and entire communities uprooted. Survivors fled to surrounding regions or were enslaved and dispersed across the Roman Empire. Yet, even in the face of such devastation, the Jewish people maintained their identity. Diaspora communities grew in Alexandria, Rome, and beyond, carrying with them the traditions, law, and memory of their homeland. These communities became crucial centers of learning, worship, and cultural preservation, ensuring that Jewish civilization would endure even without a territorial base. The revolt also intensified the spiritual and theological reflection within Judaism. Questions about divine justice, the meaning of suffering, and the future of the covenantal relationship became central to thought and practice. Texts and traditions that emerged from this period, including early rabbinic writings, sought to interpret catastrophe and exile within a framework of covenant, law, and historical memory. This reflection reinforced communal cohesion and identity, demonstrating that even in the absence of political power or territorial control, the Jewish civilization could survive through law, ritual, and shared history. The aftermath of the revolt also had profound political implications. Judea became increasingly fragmented under Roman oversight, with client kings, governors, and military commanders exercising authority. The Romans implemented policies to prevent further rebellion, including the establishment of garrisons, the construction of roads for rapid troop movement, and strict control over taxation and civic administration. These measures, while effective in maintaining order, could not extinguish the enduring sense of identity, memory, and aspiration among the Jewish people. Jerusalem, the once sacred city, was physically devastated, yet it remained central in religious imagination, liturgy, and historical consciousness. This period also laid the groundwork for subsequent uprisings and revolts, including the Bar Kokhba revolt decades later. The memory of 70 CE, the loss of the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, and the scattering of the population remained a potent symbol, motivating resistance and shaping religious and political thought. The events under the Roman eagle demonstrated both the vulnerability and the resilience of a civilization whose strength lay not in empire or army but in law, memory, and cultural cohesion. Despite defeat, the Jewish people adapted and survived. Synagogues emerged as centers of worship and learning, replacing the temple as loci of spiritual life. Rabbinic leadership and the codification of oral law provided continuity, enabling communities to maintain identity across vast distances. Jewish diaspora networks facilitated trade, cultural exchange, and the preservation of tradition. The trauma of 70 CE thus became a crucible for transformation, forging a civilization capable of enduring under foreign domination while preserving core values, laws, and memories. The destruction of the Second Temple also had broader cultural and historical significance. It marked the end of the classical period of Jewish monarchy and centralized worship, ushering in an era in which Judaism would become increasingly text-based, portable, and adaptable. The lessons of this period: resilience in the face of conquest, preservation of law and memory, and the capacity to maintain identity without territory, would shape Jewish communities for centuries, from Roman provinces to the far reaches of the Mediterranean and eventually across Europe and the Middle East. Under the Roman eagle, therefore, Jewish society faced the dual realities of loss and adaptation. Political sovereignty was gone, the temple destroyed, and Jerusalem transformed from capital to ruin. Yet the civilization endured, sustained by text, law, ritual, and collective memory. Scholars, priests, and laypeople alike contributed to a reconstruction of communal life, ensuring that Judaism was not merely a set of beliefs, but a resilient, adaptable civilization capable of surviving even in the most adverse circumstances. The period from 63 BCE to 70 CE encapsulates the tension between empire and identity, conquest and continuity, destruction and resilience, a chapter in Jewish history defined by both catastrophe and extraordinary cultural fortitude. The story of Jewish life under Roman rule reminds us that identity, memory, and law can survive even the most brutal political oppression. The legacies of the Hasmonean realm, the revolts, and the destruction of the Second Temple created a foundation for Jewish survival in diaspora, shaping religious practice, social structures, and cultural memory for centuries. The events of this period are preserved not only in archaeological ruins, Roman accounts, and Jewish historiography, but in the collective consciousness of a people who, despite the loss of land and temple, continued to define themselves through law, ritual, and remembrance. By 132 CE, decades had passed since the destruction of the Second Temple, yet the memory of Jerusalem's ruin lingered in every corner of Judea. The scars of Roman conquest were both physical and psychological. Families had been displaced, cities razed, and religious life reconfigured. Yet the desire for sovereignty, the aspiration to reclaim identity, and the dream of returning to the land of their ancestors persisted. Out of this simmering discontent arose Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic leader who would ignite the final, great rebellion against Rome, a revolt that would be remembered as both the apex of Jewish resistance and a profound tragedy. Bar Kokhba, whose name literally means son of the star, emerged in a period of tension under Roman imperial authority. Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 CE, sought to consolidate control over the eastern provinces of the empire, including Judea. Roman policies were increasingly intrusive. Construction projects, including the plan to build a Roman colony over the ruins of Jerusalem, were perceived as acts of humiliation. Religious expression was restricted, circumcision was prohibited, and Roman garrisons maintained a pervasive presence throughout the region. To the Jewish population, these measures were not mere bureaucratic reforms. They represented a direct threat to identity, law, and memory, and they set the stage for rebellion. The revolt began in earnest in 132 CE, led by Bar Kokhba, who was proclaimed by some factions as the Messiah, the divinely anointed deliverer who would restore Israel's independence. His leadership combined military skill, religious legitimacy, and strategic vision. Unlike previous revolts, the Bar Kokhba revolt was initially well-coordinated, with extensive support across Judea. Rebel forces secured fortified positions, controlled towns and rural areas, and even minted coins declaring Year 1 of the redemption of Israel. These coins were not merely currency. They were a statement of sovereignty, faith, and historical continuity. They communicated a message to both Romans and Jews. A new era had begun, one rooted in law, memory, and the hope of restoration. For 3 years, Rome's response was systematic and brutal. Hadrian dispatched 6 legions, numbering over 60,000 troops, accompanied by auxiliary forces, to crush the revolt. The Romans, experienced in siegecraft, attrition warfare, and psychological tactics, sought to eradicate the rebellion. Cities and villages were destroyed, fields burned, and civilians massacred. The scale of Roman military commitment demonstrates both the strategic importance of Judea and the perceived threat posed by Bar Kokhba's leadership. For Rome, this was not simply a local revolt. It was a challenge to imperial authority, a potential spark for wider unrest across the provinces. Despite the overwhelming odds, Bar Kokhba's forces demonstrated remarkable resilience. Tactical ingenuity, fortified positions, and deep familiarity with the landscape enabled prolonged resistance. Ambushes against Roman detachments, rapid mobilization, and the strategic use of terrain allowed the rebels to survive longer than many anticipated. This period of conflict illustrates the complexity of insurgency warfare in antiquity. Small, determined forces exploiting local knowledge and morale against a far larger, technologically superior enemy. The revolt was both a military campaign and a psychological struggle, each side seeking to assert legitimacy, dominance, and historical claim. However, the rebellion ultimately could not withstand Rome's overwhelming resources and strategic patience. By 135 CE, Roman forces had systematically reconquered strongholds, besieged cities, and eliminated pockets of resistance. Bar Kokhba was killed in battle, his body mutilated to dissuade further rebellion. Jewish casualties were catastrophic. Josephus-like accounts and later historical reconstructions describe entire towns depopulated, communities destroyed, and survivors enslaved or exiled. The demographic and cultural impact of the revolt was immense, leaving lasting scars on the population and reshaping the Jewish presence in the region. Emperor Hadrian, in an effort to erase the Jewish identity from the land, enacted policies of extraordinary severity. Jerusalem was renamed Aelia Capitolina, a Roman colony, and Jews were forbidden from entering the city under penalty of death. Sacred sites were repurposed or destroyed, inscriptions erased, and the landscape of Judea transformed to reflect Roman authority. This was not merely a military or administrative act. It was an attempt to obliterate collective memory, to rewrite history through urban planning, architecture, and legal prohibition. Yet memory persisted among the survivors, preserved through texts, oral tradition, and diaspora communities. The cultural and religious consequences of the Bar Kokhba revolt were profound. The destruction of Judea as a political entity, combined with Roman punitive measures, forced the Jewish people to reorient their identity away from sovereignty and territoriality toward law, text, and ritual. Synagogues became central to communal life, rabbinic authority was strengthened, and the study of Torah and oral law became the primary medium through which identity was maintained. The trauma of 135 CE, while devastating, catalyzed the development of a resilient civilization that would endure across centuries and continents without a central homeland. The Bar Kokhba revolt also represents the culmination of centuries of struggle between the Jewish people and imperial powers. From the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles to Hellenistic conquest, Hasmonean sovereignty, and Roman domination, the revolt was both a continuation of a historical pattern and a unique assertion of autonomy. It illustrates the persistent tension between empire and identity, conquest and cultural survival, and the extraordinary lengths to which a people will go to preserve law, faith, and collective memory. The revolt was, in essence, a defense not only of land but of civilization itself. From a historical perspective, the revolt is documented through multiple sources. Roman accounts emphasizing the scale and efficiency of suppression, Jewish historical and rabbinic texts reflecting trauma, memory, and theological interpretation, and archaeological evidence capturing the physical reality of the conflict. Excavations reveal fortresses, coins, tunnels, and signs of urban destruction, all confirming the intensity of resistance and the ferocity of Roman reprisal. These sources converge to portray a civilization caught in the ultimate struggle for survival, where faith, law, and memory became both shield and sword. The legacy of the Bar Kokhba revolt extends far beyond its immediate military and political consequences. It reshaped Jewish self-understanding, catalyzed the development of rabbinic authority, and reinforced the importance of law, text, and communal cohesion as the foundation of identity. The trauma of loss, land, temple, and autonomy became encoded in ritual, literature, and collective memory. The revolt is remembered not only for its heroism and tragic failure, but also for its affirmation of continuity, resilience, and the enduring power of a civilization to adapt to adversity. Even as Rome sought to erase the Jewish presence in Judea, the cultural and religious identity of the people persisted. Diaspora communities, already established across the Mediterranean and Near East, became crucial repositories of tradition, scholarship, and communal cohesion. Synagogues, schools, and family structures maintained ritual practice, legal observance, and historical consciousness. The Bar Kokhba revolt, catastrophic as it was, reaffirmed the centrality of memory and law in sustaining a civilization independent of territorial sovereignty. The revolt also had lasting geopolitical implications. Roman authority was solidified, Judea remained firmly within the imperial framework, and Jewish political autonomy was effectively extinguished for centuries. Yet the rebellion became a symbol of resistance, inspiring future generations and shaping Jewish narratives of identity, faith, and endurance. The destruction of Jerusalem and the prohibition against entry for Jews created a diasporic mindset, one in which survival, law, and ritual became portable and adaptable, capable of transcending geography and political power. The period from 132 to 135 CE, culminating in the Bar Kokhba revolt, encapsulates the central themes of Jewish history: resilience under conquest, preservation of law and identity, and the capacity to endure even in the absence of sovereignty. It demonstrates the interplay between memory, faith, and political ambition, highlighting the ways in which a people can maintain cultural and religious cohesion even when faced with near-total destruction. The revolt's failure, while tragic, underscores the strength of a civilization whose survival depends not solely on armies or territory, but on law, ritual, and collective consciousness. Ultimately, the revolt represents both an end and a beginning. It marked the final major attempt to restore Jewish sovereignty in the ancient homeland before centuries of diaspora, yet it also catalyzed a transformation in Jewish civilization. Law, memory, and ritual became the new pillars of identity. Synagogues replaced the temple as centers of communal life. Rabbinic leadership emerged as the guiding authority. The Bar Kokhba revolt, in all its heroism and tragedy, crystallized the enduring principle that a civilization's strength lies not in its land, but in its capacity to carry law, memory, and identity across time and space. By 135 CE, the landscape of Judea had been irrevocably altered. Cities lay in ruins, populations were scattered, and the temple, the symbolic heart of Jewish civilization, was gone. Yet through exile, adaptation, and unwavering commitment to law and memory, the Jewish people preserved their identity. The revolt, while crushed, became a defining moment in the narrative of Jewish survival, a testament to courage, resilience, and the enduring power of cultural continuity. It serves as a stark reminder that history does not merely measure conquests and defeats, but the capacity of a people to endure, remember, and rebuild in the aftermath of catastrophe. The year 135 CE marked the end of an era for the Jewish people. With the crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the destruction of Judea, and the renaming of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, the landscape of the ancient homeland was irrevocably altered. The Romans had sought to obliterate Jewish sovereignty, erase memory from the land, and disperse its people, yet their efforts could not extinguish a civilization rooted in law, ritual, and collective memory. From the ruins of revolt and devastation arose a society defined not by territory or temple, but by enduring identity, a civilization of text, tradition, and memory that would survive in diaspora for centuries. The aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt was catastrophic. Archaeological evidence across Judea reveals scorched cities, depopulated villages, and fortresses abandoned or destroyed. Roman historians recorded the scale of loss. Entire towns were annihilated, populations enslaved or killed, and the landscape systematically transformed to prevent future resistance. Sacred sites were desecrated, and prohibitions barred Jews from re-entering Jerusalem. Yet, amid the physical destruction, the culture and faith of the Jewish people were neither obliterated nor diminished. Communities that had once relied on the temple as the center of religious and civic life now turned inward to law, text, and local institutions as the diaspora, already a feature of Jewish life following Babylonian and Roman exiles, now became a defining condition. Communities spread across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Near East, settling in cities such as Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch. These communities were not simply passive recipients of tradition. They became active centers of cultural preservation, scholarship, and religious innovation. Synagogues, schools, and communal organizations allowed Jews to maintain law, practice ritual, and transmit memory across generations. Even in the heart of the empire, far from the ruins of Jerusalem, the identity of a people whose homeland had been erased persisted with remarkable resilience. Legal codification and the evolution of rabbinic authority became essential to this survival. Without the temple or monarchy, communal cohesion relied on shared law and ritual. Rabbis interpreted the Torah, applied oral traditions, and mediated disputes, providing a framework that bound communities together across space and time. The Mishnah, compiled centuries later, traces its roots to this period of adaptation, reflecting the emphasis on law, ethics, and covenantal memory. Judaism became defined less by geography and more by law, practice, and text, ensuring continuity even as political sovereignty remained out of reach. Despite the exile, cultural and intellectual life flourished. Jewish communities engaged with the surrounding Greco-Roman world, absorbing language, philosophy, and administrative techniques while maintaining a distinct identity. Jewish thinkers in Alexandria, for instance, produced literature combining scriptural interpretation with Hellenistic thought, exemplified in works such as the Septuagint. These cultural achievements demonstrate that Jewish civilization, even dispersed and under imperial domination, could adapt, innovate, and assert its distinctiveness in a complex and multicultural world. Memory, above all, became the linchpin of survival. The ruins of Jerusalem, the destroyed temple, and the lost sovereignty were transformed into symbols of endurance. Liturgy, festivals, and historical narratives ensured that generations could recall, interpret, and honor the past. The longing for Zion, the remembrance of Jerusalem, and the covenantal promise became central motifs in prayer and communal identity. Even when exiled or oppressed, Jews preserved their story. The triumphs of the Hasmoneans, the devastation of the Romans, and the hope for restoration were woven into law, ritual, and collective consciousness. This period also highlights the transformation of Jewish religious practice. Without a central temple, sacrificial rituals could not be performed traditionally. In response, prayer, study, and ethical action became substitutes for sacrificial worship. The synagogue, Torah study, and observance of mitzvot became the practical and spiritual means by which Jews fulfilled the commandments. In doing so, Judaism evolved into a faith and civilization resilient enough to endure centuries of displacement, persecution, and dispersion, relying not on land or monarchy, but on text, law, and memory. Socially, Jewish communities developed mechanisms for cohesion and survival in the diaspora. Communal leadership, charity, education, and dispute resolution were all mediated through local councils and rabbinic authority. Networks of trade, marriage, and scholarship connected communities across vast distances, creating a sense of unity even in separation. The capacity to sustain identity across geography reflected the adaptability and resilience that had characterized Jewish civilization since the earliest days in the hills of Canaan. The Bar Kokhba revolt, though a military defeat, left an enduring legacy. It marked the last major attempt at restoring Jewish sovereignty in the ancient homeland before the Roman exile would define diaspora life. The memory of resistance, the courage of leaders, and the sacrifices of ordinary people became central narratives, celebrated in liturgy, stories, and historical reflection. This period demonstrates a profound principle of Jewish history. Even in the absence of political power or territorial control, the civilization could endure through law, ritual, and memory. The transformation initiated after 135 CE laid the groundwork for centuries of Jewish survival. From this point onward, Jewish communities would thrive in regions as diverse as Babylonia, the Levant, North Africa, and Europe. The emphasis on portable institutions, synagogues, schools, and texts enabled a civilization unbound by territory. Rabbinic leadership ensured continuity, codifying law and practice to guide dispersed communities. Memory of Jerusalem and the Temple continued to define identity, ensuring that even in exile, Jews remained connected to their heritage and history. This era also illustrates a broader historical principle. Civilizations can survive destruction not merely through conquest or resilience in war, but through the preservation of culture, law, and memory. The Jewish people, faced with overwhelming military defeat and systematic erasure, transformed their identity from one tied to land and temple to one rooted in text, law, and communal practice. It is a story not of annihilation, but of adaptation, a civilization that remembered, that preserved, and that endured. The consequences of this transformation are still visible today. Jewish law, ritual, and scholarship trace their roots to this period of adaptation. The synagogue, the rabbi, and the study of Torah, all institutional innovations emerging from the aftermath of 135 CE, continue to define Jewish life. Diaspora communities maintained identity without a central state, sustaining a civilization across continents and centuries. Memory became the mechanism by which culture and religion survived, ensuring that the Jewish story, begun in stone with the Merneptah Stele and carried through centuries of exile, remained unbroken. In essence, the destruction of Judea and the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt did not signal the end of Jewish civilization. It signaled a profound transformation. The people adapted to circumstances of displacement, creating a society in which identity, law, and faith were portable, resilient, and enduring. Exile became a condition for survival, and memory became a source of strength. Through ritual, text, and scholarship, Jewish civilization continued to flourish, even in the absence of land, temple, or monarchy. The echoes of the vanished kingdom resonate in every aspect of Jewish life after 135 CE. Historical consciousness, liturgy, communal governance, and legal codification ensured continuity. Diaspora communities remained connected by shared law, language, and ritual practice. The longing for Jerusalem, the remembrance of the temple, and the stories of revolt and survival preserved a sense of identity that transcended geography. In this way, the Jewish people transformed catastrophe into resilience, loss into memory, and exile into civilization. Ultimately, the period following 135 CE exemplifies a defining characteristic of the Jewish people: the ability to endure, adapt, and preserve identity through law, ritual, and memory. The Bar Kokhba revolt, the destruction of Judea, and the dispersal of the population were catastrophic events, yet they catalyzed innovations in religious, legal, and social organization that ensured the survival of a civilization. Jewish history, beginning with the first mention of Israel in 1208 BCE and culminating in the transformations of the post-revolt period, demonstrates a remarkable continuity, a civilization that, even when conquered, erased, and exiled, remembered. This is the story of a people who carried their homeland in their laws, their rituals, and their collective memory, ensuring that centuries of conquest, exile, and destruction could not erase them. The echoes of a vanished kingdom, of Jerusalem, the temple, the revolts, and the sacred covenant resonated far beyond the borders of Judea, shaping the trajectory of Jewish civilization for millennia. It is a testament to endurance, to the power of memory, and to the resilience of a people whose identity is preserved not solely by territory, but by the very act of remembering.